So when teaching or talking about ecosystem services to my students or to my colleagues, I sometimes encounter a little bit of resistance, especially when we start talking about the monetization of some of these values. We're fortunate in this course to have two specialists, people who have thought quite a bit about these matters, and I want to get them to dialogue with one another to try and get at a little bit more what the implications of different positions might be. The purpose of this debate is to help you, the learners, also identify which positions you're most comfortable with. So here we're going to have a dialogue between Pavan Sukdhev and Mike Hannis, who you've met previously, and I'm going to ask them a series of questions and let them each take their turn at responding to it, and hopefully this is going to bring to light some of the key differences. So Mike, if I may begin with you, perhaps start by beginning and stating what your view of the ecosystem service method is and its primary benefit.
I think the idea is to apply economic tools and analyses to environmental matters, but with the idea that that's what's needed in order to get the ear of policymakers and business and people with the power to do something about things. But I think this is perhaps a bit of a mistake. I'm worried that nature is not a service provider, the world is not made of capital. You know, these are kind of category errors to me.
So Pavan, how about you? When you talk about the ecosystem services to your daughters and your friends, how do you put forth, or what do you put forth in terms of the primary benefit of the method?
Well, I take the view that the T books have taken, and let me just read from what it says, because here we write, and I quote, "The root causes of biodiversity loss lie in the nature of the human relationship with nature and in our dominant economic model. We have not widely understood that our survival depends on coexistence, on living in harmony with nature." And we go on to say that essentially we would not adopt our damaging behaviors if our relationship with nature were one of coexistence and responsible stewardship. Now, the sad thing is that we are not where we should be. And part of the reason is that the loss of reconnection, of that connection with nature, is because we no longer are living in and with nature. We are no longer like the tribal community from which we came. We have become this highly organized, highly technocratic, highly economized society, and therefore we need to use the languages of technology and economics to somehow reignite our awareness of how important nature remains in our lives and how fundamental it is.
Do you agree with that, Mike?
I think fundamentally we do agree. I very much agree that there's a problem in the relationship with nature that is underpinning our modern societies. I'm skeptical, though, that we can fix that using the very thinking that created the problem. I think Einstein's supposed to have said something similar, isn't he? But yeah, it's that economistic thinking, seeing nature as resources and something to commodify, arguably is what has got us where we are. And if we're trying to get somewhere else, we maybe need some different thinking.
Can you think of an example where, okay, so to make things a little bit oversimplified, but basically everyone seems to agree that society has gotten itself into a place where, despite multiple benefits in terms of health and education and poverty reduction, there are some drawbacks to our current situation. And if I understand correctly, Pavan is saying, let's try and use valuation and sometimes monetization to try and bring to light these values and try and up the value through that tool. And Mike, you're saying, no, we're just perpetuating the same mistake a little bit further. Is that correct, or is that fair to say?
I think broadly correct, yeah. I mean, I don't think either that we can fix the situation with these tools, or indeed that these tools are an effective way of communicating with people that we need a different relationship. We're sort of perpetuating an economic framing of the problem. And I think if we want to talk about values, we should talk about values.
Can you see perhaps one example or some scenarios where monetization has been beneficial?
Well, monetization, I would say, no, I can't see that. I mean, I can see valuation of a non-financial kind is, of course, beneficial every time we do it, and we designate an area to protect it, or we make regulations to improve air quality, ocean quality, whatever. That's because there is underlying valuation of what's going on, absolutely. But I think once we try and convert that and express it in financial terms, I can't, off the top of my head, think of an example where that has been positive, no.
But Pavan, in your lectures, you gave some examples about wetlands and the water purification properties of those wetlands where, if I understood correctly, the monetization of those services brought the issue to light and the policy decision was made to protect those services.
Yes,
is that correct?
Yeah, there are actually more than 50 examples of where demonstrating value or capturing value through some form of payments for ecosystem services has actually stemmed the loss of that ecosystem and actually created a more responsible framework for people to make use of it in a manner that doesn't destroy it. And of course, there are examples where purely just demonstrating, I think to your point, Mike, in terms of why would the economics work when it has caused the problem? I think because we are not using the right economics. We're basically using an economics which considers natural capital as invisible. So it's like having a scale where you're making a trade-off where there's something on one side of the scale and there's an emptiness on the other side. And what we are saying is that fill that emptiness with what at least you know is the economic value that comes to this society and its economy from nature. So don't try and make a trade-off where you pretend that what's in one side of the scale is actually empty. It's not.
Pavan, can you, however, think of an example, or in your experience, have you come across a scenario where by putting a monetary value on an ecosystem service, that message was perverted or led to an undesirable outcome?
I fear that. I mean, to be totally honest, because we've been careful how we use valuation as a tool, I don't see cases of that happening, but I have a strong fear that the misuse of valuation in the hands, for instance, of private agents who want to argue, for example, that a particular river or a particular forest generates too little value compared to the mine that lies underneath, gives that particular private agent the ability to influence his government or her government and in fact get hold of the mine, which is exactly the opposite of what we want. So this is a constant fear that I have. And this is why I go back to saying that before you begin a valuation, before you start using the language of economics to affect policy, please be clear about the purpose of valuation. And if the purpose is to basically destroy public wealth and to create private profits, then be upfront with your community and your society saying this is what you want to do. You want to, in the words of, for instance, the Supreme Court of India, when they ruled in India, this is a case where I was involved with the Bombay Environmental Action Group. We won the High Court case against the mill lands being converted, taken away instead of being converted to a natural area. But the Supreme Court ruled that it was the intention of the state government to do so. So therefore we lost on a point of fact, not a point of principle. So there are cases where governments make perverse decisions, in my opinion, against the public interest, but they need to be transparent about that and then let the people decide whether they did the right thing or the wrong thing.
Mike?
Yeah, no, I find that reassuring that that you're saying very clearly that this approach should not be used to justify private profit taking.
Privatization.
Yeah, privatization of resources. But I suppose I'm less confident that it won't end up that way. I mean, you said before that we're in a situation in which natural capital is invisible, and I think I understand what you mean, but I mean, natural capital, surely, doesn't that also include things like oil, timber, fish, all these things that have been overexploited? And it wasn't invisible at all, was it? It was because it was very visible that we've ended up where we are.
Well, in the case of minerals, of course, the typical game that's been played is in order to provide development opportunity, building, ultimately everything built is either mined or grown. I'd rather that it be grown rather than mined, but the reality is it's mined. So we've had this constant problem everywhere in the world where mining destroys local ecosystems and creates huge pollutions and destroys proximate ecosystems, destroys fresh water, and it's still happening. I mean, the Samarco dam burst in Brazil is a classic example of that, which has been allowed to happen under our very noses. So we have this problem, and I think what we are saying is that do not pretend as if the rivers into which the tailing dam of Samarco burst were a nothing. They were destroyed ecosystems of huge value. Do not pretend that you are, quote unquote, creating development for your country if all you're doing is converting public assets into private profits and creating public losses. So this language is the language of economics. What we are saying is it is not okay to convert public wealth into private profits ad nauseum, because finally it's us, the people, who will suffer due to lack of public wealth. So it's the use of the language of economics, the arguments of economics, to make the case that there is something in that other side of that scale, that so-called trade-off that you're making is not against nothing, it's against something highly valuable.
Yes, no, that sounds very reasonable, but I'm aware that, I mean, you mentioned mining. I mean, mining and big extractive industries oddly seem to be in the forefront of using this language and wanting to use this language to justify their impacts. I mean, there's a case with I think an ilmenite mine in Madagascar that's like much sort of celebrated as successful use of biodiversity offsetting to sort of somehow show that the impact of the mine is less than it might otherwise seem, and you know, without going into details, some of the sort of calculations there are really highly suspect. We could go into details, but that's I mean, do you not recognise that these extractive industries are sort of seizing hold of this terminology and trying to use it?
I do sense a more than average amount of interest from the extractive industries, and I do suspect the rationale for that. And that this is why I would always say, before you continue the second sentence of your discussion with a mining industry about why are they interested in ecosystem valuation, ask them, what's the purpose of your valuation? If you've established purpose, as we've discussed in one of the earlier lectures in this course, once you've established purpose, then I think the discourse becomes different, because then there is transparency on purpose. If it is the purpose to protect ecosystems and biodiversity, you go on to the next stage of the discourse. If the purpose is clear that it is merely to provide a price, as in a price for conversion of a public asset into a private good, well, you may terminate that discourse at that point.
So Mike, I'm hearing a little bit of skepticism. It's as if this economic language is letting the genie out of the bottle, and once it's out, then it might be appropriated by people with ulterior motives. Can you perhaps say a little bit more about your worldview and what you would like to see being done instead? What would you like, a different discourse or a different approach, or what do you think could substitute the economic framework that we currently have?
Well, that's obviously a pretty big question, but I think in any of these contexts, you do need to examine how you ended up where you are, and what is the, for instance, with mining, what exactly is the need for whatever is being mined, and is there perhaps some decision that can be made at some other level which might result in those materials not being needed to be mined at all? I mean, that's always the place to start, isn't it? With the I guess the mitigation hierarchy, you need to start at the top, and that would be one thing I'd like to say about that.
Could I respond to that?
Of course, yeah.
By saying that I agree with Mike that that's something that we need to address. So very often the mining company that talks the language of we wish to value ecosystem services should be asked to talk the language of, can you please tell us what's your impact on ecosystem services? What's your company's impact on ecosystem services? How much area destroyed and loss of the future flow of goods and services from that area are you responsible for? Can we please measure those ecosystem services, not just some random area close to where you'd like to mine? So I think that you need to use that. I mean, it is the valuation argument I sometimes describe as the economic argument. We've been told forever that anyone who protects the environment is anti-development. Anyone who is getting in the way of development is therefore clearly socially irresponsible. And I'm trying to point out that, sorry gentlemen, you've got the cannon pointed in the wrong direction. Turn it around and then see what it looks like and feels like. Because that cannon is pointing at you. It is saying that you are the one who is destroying public assets and public wealth in the slim pursuit of private profits. That's an economic case.
I'd like to move along and ask you a question that's related a little bit more to sustainable finance. There are some banks, some large banks like Credit Suisse, that are coming out with new reports that are trying to convert some of these natural capital assets and ecosystem services into something that can be monetized, and at least where the banks can provide a service that somehow facilitates this transaction. So the students have access to this report, and I want to help, I'd like to ask you both to perhaps give some clues on how you would interpret the appearance of these documents and how you would read them. Mike?
Okay. Well, I guess I'd start by saying I'm not a banker, I'm not an economist, so I very much appreciate the difficulty of coming to these kind of documents from scratch. But I have looked at a few, and some themes do kind of recur, and frankly I find them worrying, and the one that you refer to in the title, as they call it, levering ecosystems, I think perhaps often you might call it leveraging. So what they seem to be proposing is that, well, it's about making a margin, isn't it? It's about making it economically attractive and profitable for companies. In this case, it's companies. Sometimes it's about states, but in this case, it's talking about private companies and how it can be profitable for them to invest in ecosystem services. And I guess several things arise at that point. One, well, why should it be profitable? Even if it's not profitable, that's no reason not to do it. And if it's the case that companies are doing things that are destructive, then that should be regulated and put a stop to. It's not about trying to persuade them necessarily. So, but more specifically, what seems to be being proposed in that report is that public money that is put into environmental protection or facilitating environmental protection can be somehow captured and leveraged into larger funds on which a margin can be made. And that I find quite worrying.
So just as a follow-up, Mike, is there, or can one not make the argument that the appearance of these big players like banks might in fact facilitate the protection and the safeguarding of ecosystem services?
Well, it very much depends what they do. I mean, I don't think that we should be happy about getting them round the table necessarily, because, I mean, some people worry, for instance, that we could see a carbon bubble akin to the subprime mortgage bubble that we saw in 2008, you know, or we could see sort of all kinds of unforeseen financial consequences arising from people resisting the idea that actually their fossil fuel assets are now stranded, and so the values of their companies are not as advertised. So, I mean, these are significant problems, and having these people involved does not make me feel confident. No, it makes me worried.
What would you say about this report, or what sort of advice would you give your students on how to interpret its appearance?
Yeah, a general point is, because they may or may not apply to this particular report, but I'd like to say that the first thing to look for and understand is that private wealth seeks private profits. And therefore, if you're not seeing a clear business case where that private wealth is engaging in some kind of scheme like a REDD+ scheme where it's providing reforestation benefits but earning from it through REDD+, or if it's raising a green bond in order to increase the greenness of the supply chain of palm oil or of logging and somehow getting a premium for that greenness. If you're not seeing that business case, then disbelieve it. Do not assume that just because there is a nice environmental idea embedded somewhere in the document that it's necessarily going to work. It may not. Look for the business case. That's my first point. And the business case typically will come through the value chain being changed and generating a value which is being purchased by investors or purchased by consumers, or it'll come from some kind of carbon or freshwater benefit being created which already has a government subsidy or a government support scheme which seeks that particular carbon benefit or that particular freshwater benefit. In the absence of such a scheme, you may be just dreaming.
Yeah, so that's helpful. I mean, I think as I hear it, you're kind of agreeing that the income stream may well actually be coming from public funds.
Of course. It more often than not is. In fact, most of the payments for ecosystem services, as we call them, which are documented, more than 50 odd of them in the TEEB reports, at least one side of them is the government, some local government or a national government.
So then I'd ask, how ethical is it really for private companies to be coming along and skimming off the top of those public funds that have been put in order to create environmental benefits, not in order to create profit?
Right, but the point I would counter with is that those funds are there to protect that public asset, which is nature, and to protect the flow of public wealth, that is ecosystem services, that are coming from that natural area, be it a river or a forest or a wetland or whatever it might be. And at present, it is undergoing severe depletion because everyone's grabbing it, because it's an open space. You can grab the land, you can grab the product, you can grab the water, you can grab everything. And this is normally a way of preventing that land grab or that water grab from happening, and creating some degree of order where a responsible agent delivers a service, as in managing the natural commons, and gets paid for it, i.e. generates forests, improves clean water, etc., etc. So it's a question of paying a private agent for delivering a public service. And by the way, that happens all the time. Railways, for instance, are a public service, but it's usually a private corporation that delivers them to us.
Well, I of course live in the UK, and our railways have been privatised and it's been a disaster, but that's a very different discussion. It's interesting, we seem to be agreeing that in fact strong governmental action is always going to be a key part of getting anything done here, and and I very much agree with that. And I think we see elsewhere that in what we sort of sometimes call neoliberalism, it's often the case that the resources of the state are sort of diverted into producing private profit, and I'm heartened that we both seem to be fairly solidly against that.
No, I think, and I believe both of us have to be for the fundamental reason of equity, which is that the natural commons is usually a resource for a community or an entire society, and for that to be preempted by a private interest really needs a fair price to be paid to that community. And usually this is not happening. Usually the licensee is either bribing or being favored by the government for some reason and ending up with a diminution in the value to society because they've made some private profits, but at a huge and much larger cost to public wealth. That's what I have a fundamental, and I would say ethical and economic objection to both sides.
So gentlemen, this is interesting, and I'm hearing some areas of overlap where you both seem to agree that there is a depletion of natural capital, but perhaps to wrap up, can you try and verbalize what you see as the key differences between your two positions? Mike, do you want to start with that interesting exercise?
Okay. Well, I think Pavan's doing a valuable job that I'm sure he sees as pragmatic of trying to marshal the existing resources that in the world to sort of address these problems. And I guess I'm maybe in a slightly different place of thinking that perhaps we can't fix the systems of power and socio-economic priorities that we are existing within, and in fact we need to address those to get anywhere with the environmental problems that
So you think we have to do much more fundamental questioning about the way our society and our governance works if we want to have a more durable change? Is that correct?
I think that yes, that's broadly correct, and I would say that's an optimistic perspective. Those of us that are sort of not so convinced by these approaches are often accused of being pessimists, but I would say that in fact it's the promoters of these approaches that are potentially pessimistic rather than pragmatic, because they're kind of writing out the idea, the possibility of more fundamental social and political change. And I totally appreciate why, but my job as a philosopher and as an ethicist is to kind of be attentive to the fact that it may well be that more fundamental change is required.
Pavan, how would you try and describe these two positions?
Well, I think there is a connection here, because so we describe, when I say we, the TEEB community would describe valuation as a human institution, but always then would say what was the purpose of that valuation, and then in the next stage would be looking for the responses. And actually, if you look at the responses, legislation is a very important response. Management of public lands, basically spatial planning, is a very important response. Providing payments for ecosystem services in a way that, yes, maybe a private agent or maybe a public agent is paid, but for conserving a public wealth which would otherwise be lost. that is a viable response. Incentivizing certifications to improve the environmental quality of whatever is on offer, I think again a viable, valid response. So these are different forms of, I would say, valid responses to valuation. But at the heart of it, I must agree with Mike's concern, which is that too often this process that I described gets preempted or hijacked or stolen by private interests in the pursuit of private profits and at the severe cost. Finally, I think the place where valuation perhaps is the most important, and perhaps which we should spend more time in the rest of this course focusing on, is in countries where there is poverty and there is natural wealth. Very often we find that the poor are prevented from accessing, even on a sustainable basis, the natural wealth which is a large part of their household income, what we call the GDP of the poor. And it's truly crucial for the governments of those countries where this is happening to recognize and measure the GDP of the poor and to protect it from dissipating and disappearing, because there is no such thing as development which depletes half the household income in some vainglorious hope that these people can be converted into industrial engineers or IT engineers or rocket scientists. That isn't going to happen. They are poor farmers, they are forest dependent tribals. We need to measure what nature provides to them, and through that measurement, not on an absolute basis but on a relative basis. In other words, is it 50%, 70% and 90%, and these are actual numbers. Recognize that this is truly significant to maintain and conserve whilst we pursue development.
Absolutely.
Sure, go ahead.
I would just add that there is also another side to that picture, isn't there, which is that there is also such a thing as overdevelopment, and we need to look at that as well.
Which is where we are.
Perhaps we are, yeah.
Yes.
So hopefully one of the things that you will have heard in this debate and this exchange is that this field of ecosystem services, while steeped historically in economic evaluation, there seems to be at least some people who are questioning whether this is even a path we wish to go down. Is this something that by using we will be simply perpetuating the problems, or do we need to take one step further back and question the fundamentals of how our governance is run, how our society is run? This is what I personally find exciting about the development of this field, and I hope you'll agree with this, is that there still is some decisions to be made in how this field is going to evolve in the future. And I think it's through these types of exchanges that we'll be able to make a slightly more informed societal decisions about where we want to go in the future. Thanks very much, gentlemen.